The parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is your neighbor? According to the Bible, a man lies on the side of the road. He's broken, bleeding, barely breathing, stripped of everything. He's too weak to cry for help. People pass by respected, religious people, but no one stops until someone does. And that someone? The last person anyone expected. This is more than a story. It's a mirror, a parable that Jesus told not just to illustrate kindness, but to expose hearts, to challenge our assumptions about love, justice, and what it really means to follow Him. We've heard it before, the parable of the Good Samaritan, but if we're not careful, we'll nod along while missing the radical, uncomfortable truth tucked inside. Love, in the way Jesus defines it, will always stretch us beyond what's convenient. When Jesus told this parable, He wasn't just responding to a curious question about eternal life. He was dismantling a carefully constructed worldview. A religious expert had asked, "Who is my neighbor?" But what he was really asking was, "Who do I have to love?" He was looking for limits, boundaries, exceptions, and in response, Jesus told a story that shattered them all. Today, that same question lingers in the air. Who is your neighbor? In a world that celebrates echo chambers and draws hard lines between us and them, Jesus' words still confront us. We scroll past suffering, filter out the unfamiliar, and justify selective compassion. But the gospel doesn't leave room for safe love. Jesus invites us into a kingdom where your neighbor isn't defined by similarity or proximity, but by need and your willingness to see it. This story is personal because we all stand somewhere in it. Maybe we've been the man on the road, hurt, overlooked, desperate for someone to care. Maybe we've been the priest or the Levite, too busy, too afraid, too preoccupied with appearances. Maybe we've even tried to convince ourselves that love has limits. But through this parable, Jesus shows us another way, a way that begins with compassion, walks toward pain, and refuses to let differences become distance. This is the heart of the gospel, because once, long ago, we were the ones lying helpless and Christ Himself became our Good Samaritan. So let's lean in, not just to admire the story, but to be changed by it. Because Jesus isn't just telling us what happened on a road between Jerusalem and Jericho. He's inviting us to step into the story, to become the one who stops, the one who loves, the one who sees. It started with a question, not an innocent one, a loaded one. A lawyer, a man trained in the law of Moses, stood up in a crowd, not to learn, but to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now pause. Right there. This wasn't a man searching for truth. This was a man trying to prove a point. In his mind, he already had the answers, but he wanted to trap Jesus, to expose a weakness, to elevate himself. What he didn't realize was that Jesus wasn't the one being tested, he was. Jesus responded with a question of his own. "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" The man answered, "Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus nodded. "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But that answer stung a little, because deep down, the lawyer knew he hadn't really loved like that. So in an effort to justify himself, to narrow the scope of the command and make it more manageable, he asked the infamous follow-up, "And who is my neighbor?" Let's pause here again. That question is the heart of the entire parable. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he wanted limits, boundaries. He wanted to know, where does my responsibility end? If I can define who counts as my neighbor, then I can also define who doesn't. That way, I can love on my terms. That way, I can still look righteous without being inconvenienced. And how often do we do the same? We're fine loving people we like. We'll show kindness to those who look like us, think like us, vote like us, worship like us. But when love starts to cost, when it demands we cross a line, break a bias, or touch pain that makes us uncomfortable, we start asking the same question: do I really have to love them? In response, Jesus didn't give a theological breakdown. He didn't offer a definition. He told a story, and in that story, he didn't just answer the question, he turned it inside out. He didn't define a neighbor, he described one, because being a neighbor isn't about who they are, it's about who you are. The parable of the Good Samaritan doesn't just tell us who to love. It reveals the condition of our hearts. And in this story, Jesus is about to show us what love actually looks like when it's more than words. The story begins on a stretch of road infamous for danger, a rugged, twisting path from Jerusalem to Jericho. Travelers knew it as treacherous territory. Bandits often lurked in the shadows. The road was long, rocky, and steep, and it was on this very road that a man unspecified in ethnicity or status was attacked. He was beaten, stripped, robbed, left half dead. Let's stop right there. This is not just a background detail, it's a central moment in the story, because it sets the stage for compassion. There can be no mercy if there is no need. There can be no neighbor unless someone is hurting. This man, nameless and faceless, becomes a symbol for every person who's ever been beaten down by life. Maybe you've been there. Maybe it wasn't a physical attack, but emotional. Maybe you've been stripped of dignity, wounded by words, robbed of hope, or left by others to suffer alone. The ditch is not unfamiliar. Jesus starts here because before we can understand compassion, we must first face suffering, and not just suffering in theory but in reality. The man is vulnerable, exposed, and dying, and the world keeps moving. Pain is a universal language, but our response to it, that's where the story unfolds. As Jesus tells it, the man can do nothing to help himself. He can't call out. He can't defend. He's at the mercy of whoever passes by, and in that place of need, we begin to see the heart of humanity laid bare. Because pain forces a decision. Will you pass by, or will you stop? It's easy to feel sympathy from a distance, but compassion requires proximity. It requires us to get close enough to see, and to feel, and to act. In this broken, hurting man, we see the reality of a world full of Jericho roads, full of people bleeding from trauma, injustice, abuse, addiction, grief, and loneliness. And they're not just strangers in faraway places. They're co-workers, neighbors, classmates, family members. Sometimes we walk past them because we're too busy. Other times because we're afraid. Still other times because we think it's not our problem. But Jesus forces us to see what we so often avoid. This story starts with a man in the dirt because love starts in the dirt, where it's messy, where it's inconvenient, where it costs something. And until we recognize the brokenness around us and within us, we'll never truly understand what Jesus is calling us to do. Jesus continues, two men walk the same road, see the same broken man, and make the same tragic decision. They keep walking. The first is a priest, a man of God, a spiritual leader, the one who offers sacrifices, teaches the law, and represents holiness to the people. The priest sees the man. He doesn't miss him, but he crosses to the other side and moves on. Next comes a Levite, also from the tribe responsible for temple duties, another man known for religious devotion. He also sees the man, and he also walks away. You can imagine the audience leaning in. This is unexpected. These are the ones who should have helped, the ones who knew the law about loving your neighbor, the ones who taught mercy, and yet when faced with a real, bleeding human in need, they choose convenience over compassion. And Jesus is making a point. Religion is not love. Knowledge is not mercy. Proximity to sacred things does not automatically create sacred hearts. Now, to be fair, we can assume the priest and Levite had their reasons. Maybe they feared ritual impurity. Maybe they thought it was a trap. Maybe they were running late to important duties. Maybe they just didn't want to deal with the mess. Whatever the excuse, it led to avoidance. And avoidance, in this case, was deadly. Let's be honest, this hits home. Because too often, we act the same way. We see the need. We scroll past it. We drive by it. We hear about it in the next cubicle, the next pew, the next city, and instead of moving toward it, we move around it. We convince ourselves it's not our place or not the right time. We say, I'll pray about it, when what God might be asking is for us to act about it. The priest and Levite remind us that spiritual activity can sometimes mask spiritual apathy, that our titles, routines, and knowledge mean little if they don't translate into love. Jesus wasn't condemning temple service. He was exposing the disconnect between public devotion and private compassion. And through this, he's asking us a question we can't ignore. Are we living a faith that stops or one that walks by? Because in the end, it won't matter how many verses we know if we don't live the ones about mercy. It won't matter how often we go to church if we never carry Christ to the wounded. The priest and Levite had influence, but it was the Samaritan who had impact. And that changes everything. Then comes the twist, one that must have stunned Jesus' original audience. A third traveler appears on the scene, but not a fellow Jew, not a religious leader, not someone anyone in that crowd would have expected to be the hero. He was a Samaritan. Now, to our modern ears, Samaritan might sound neutral, maybe even noble, but to the Jewish audience listening, that word would have triggered disgust, suspicion, even anger. Jews and Samaritans had centuries of hostility between them, rooted in theological, ethnic, and historical conflict. Samaritans were considered heretics, unclean, unworthy, and yet Jesus places this man, this outsider, at the center of compassion. The Samaritan comes upon the same beaten man, sees the same broken body, and chooses to stop the other's past. By he draws near. He is moved with compassion. The text says, not just pity, not guilt, but something deeper is stirring in his soul that leads to action. That he approaches the man, cleans his wounds, pours oil and wine, his own resources on the injuries, wraps them with his own hands, lifts the man onto his own donkey, walks while the injured man rides, takes him to an inn, pays for his care, promises to come back and cover any extra cost. This isn't a random act of kindness. It's a full-blown sacrifice. The Samaritan gives his time, his money, his safety, his dignity, all for someone who, under normal circumstances, may not have even spoken to him. That's the beauty of the story. It cuts across every line we draw. Race, religion, culture, social status, politics. It says that love doesn't ask, do you deserve this? Love simply gives, because that's what God does. In fact, this Samaritan looks a whole lot like Jesus. Jesus, too, was rejected by his own. He came to the broken. He crossed boundaries. He lifted the helpless. He paid the price. He loved not just in theory, but in blood, sweat, and tears. The parable doesn't just point to a moral lesson, it whispers the gospel, and it invites us to live the same way. To love when it's risky, to serve when it's costly, to show compassion when it's uncomfortable. That's the heart of being a neighbor, not limited by geography or ideology, but shaped by mercy. The Samaritan teaches us this: your neighbor is anyone whose pain you're close enough to see. After finishing the story, Jesus looks the lawyer in the eye and asks, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The lawyer can't even say Samaritan. He simply replies, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. That's it. No debate, no loopholes, no theological footnotes. Just a simple, direct, life-changing command. Go and do likewise. In other words, become the neighbor. The lawyer came trying to limit love. Jesus widened it beyond imagination. The lawyer asked, who is my neighbor? Jesus flipped the question. What kind of neighbor will you be? We often want to keep compassion manageable, scheduled, predictable. But love that reflects Jesus is interruptible, inconvenient. It takes risks and rewrites priorities. It doesn't wait to be asked, it steps into the pain. So what does that look like today? It looks like seeing the homeless man, not as a problem to avoid, but as a person to embrace. It looks like slowing down when your schedule says keep moving. It looks like speaking up for the silenced, sitting with the grieving, opening your table to someone who can't repay you. It looks like loving your enemy not with empty words, but with real grace. And yes, it looks like helping people who might not look like you, think like you, vote like you, or believe like you. Because Jesus didn't say, love your comfortable neighbor. He said, love your neighbor, full stop. Becoming a neighbor is about transformation. It's not about checking a religious box. It's about living the kind of love that disrupts, challenges, and heals. The kind of love that leaves the 99 to go after the one. The kind of love that Jesus modeled again and again. So let's stop looking for who qualifies as our neighbor and start becoming one. Let's become the people who stop, who listen, who see, who act. Because when you love like that, you're not just being kind, you're showing the world what God is. Like, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho still exists, not the literal path, but the symbolic one. The road filled with brokenness, injustice, abandonment, and silent suffering. Every day, people are still lying in ditches wounded by life, waiting for someone to stop. And the question isn't whether they're out there. The question is, will we be the ones who stop? The parable of the Good Samaritan is not just a story about generosity. It's a story about transformation. Jesus tells us that eternal life is tied not just to believing the right things, but to loving the right way. And that kind of love, it has a cost. It gets dirty. It breaks cultural rules, but it changes the world. Let's not forget where we started. We've all been the man in the ditch, broken by sin, unable to save ourselves. And Jesus came. He crossed every boundary. He lifted us up. He paid the price. He made us whole. The ultimate Good Samaritan walked into our pain and brought us back to life. Now he says, go and do likewise. Go and see the unseen. Go and love the outcast. Go and walk into messes with mercy. Go and be the kind of neighbor this world desperately needs. Because love that stays safe isn't love at all. Real love walks the road. Real love stops. Real love heals. So let's stop asking, who's my neighbor? And let's start living the answer. You are called to be the one who sees, the one who stays, the one who loves. The road is waiting. Someone is hurting. Will you be the one who stops?